I'm Amy Southerden, Assistant Director at the Center for the Study of Canada, an Institute on Quebec Studies at SUNY Plattsburgh, and I'm delighted to welcome you to the inaugural session of the virtual Conversations on Canada series. The Conversations on Canada webinar series is organized by the Center for the Study of Canada and Institute on Quebec Studies at the State University of New York, College at Plattsburgh, a U.S. Department of Education Title VI National Resource Center on Canada, with additional support from the Quebec Ministry of International Relations and La Francophonie. Developed in response to the COVID-19 pandemic, the Conversations on Canada series addresses current issues central to a fuller understanding of Canadian society. Thank you for joining us today, and most importantly, we hope you are in good physical and mental health. We have a diverse audience from across the US and Canada joining us today, and especially appreciate participation from SUNY Plattsburgh students, faculty, and staff, business people of our New York State North Country region, as well as scholarly members of the Association of Canadian Studies in the United States. We appreciate everyone's interest in this webinar and look forward to an engaging time together. While we are in a virtual webinar environment, we welcome you to submit questions in the Q&A box on your screen. Again, questions in the Q&A box, and otherwise, feel free to use the chat for comments. At this time, it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Christopher Kirkey, Director of the Center for the Study of Canada and Institute on Quebec Studies at SUNY Plattsburgh, and President of the Association for Canadian Studies in the United States. Chris's area of specialty is Canada-US relations and Canadian foreign policy. For our inaugural talk of the Conversations on Canada series, Chris is discussing why is Donald Trump mad at Canada? Understanding American foreign policy toward Canada. Welcome, Chris.
Thank you, Amy, very much, and welcome, and thank you, each and every one of you, for joining us today. You'll see I'm standing at a podium right now. I'm bent over it, and I know we're billing this as Conversations on Canada, and it might seem a bit out of place for someone to be offering a conversation at a podium, but the truth is my back hasn't been very good this week, and I need to stand, so hence my position here today. The idea of this conversation series is, as Amy suggests, very straightforward. We've got to deal with this COVID-19 pandemic, but yet it's important that we stay engaged, and we stay engaged on issues of concern to individuals interested in Canada across the spectrum. The title you might find a bit interesting today is Donald Trump mad, or why is he mad at Canada? And you might wonder, is this a bit of an anomaly? Because people know very well that during his term as president, Trump has been quite outspoken, publicly outspoken on a repeated basis, as has his chief supporters and chief officers in and outside of his cabinet. In June of 2018, upon leaving a G7 summit in Charlevoix, Quebec, President Trump called Canadian Prime Minister Trudeau, quote, very dishonest and weak. And he said that Trudeau was prone to false statements. And those types of remarks have been echoed, and that type of attitude has been echoed, as I say, by Trump's principal advisors. Larry Kudlow has suggested that Trudeau has, at that particular meeting, stabbed us in the back. And Peter Navarro had this to say about Prime Minister Trudeau, saying that there's a special place in hell for the Prime Minister. Well, the truth is, if you look at the long history of the Canada-US relationship, I think it's very clear, most scholars will point out, and most individuals, that there have been periods when that relationship has been cool, if you will, and there have been other times when that relationship between presidents and prime ministers has been decidedly less than warm, if you will. Some of those more obvious cases are Richard Nixon and Pierre Trudeau, Prime Minister Jean Chrétien and President George Walker Bush, when Lester Pearson went and gave a speech in 1965 at Temple University criticizing American policy in Vietnam, President Lyndon Baines Johnson wasn't so happy and told Mr. Pearson in a very aggressive, confrontational way right at the White House. We've had many others, but we've also conversely had periods when the US-Canada relationship has been decidedly warm and cozy, and when personal relationships between presidents and prime ministers have illustrated this. We've seen it in the 1980s in the relationship between President Ronald Reagan and Prime Minister Brian Mulroney. We saw it with President Bill Clinton and Prime Minister Jean Chrétien. So it goes back and forth, but what we're sort of looking at now is qualitatively and quantitatively, in some respects, very different. So what do we mean exactly when we're talking about Donald Trump being mad, if you will, at Canada and sort of orchestrating American foreign policy towards Canada in a similar fashion? Well, I think the central point I want to give you today or suggest to you is that in order to explain our understanding of America's current foreign policy towards Canada, we must recognize above all else that Trump's priorities and actions reflect the president's approach towards American engagement in the world at large. So in other words, what we're seeing towards Canada, one might argue, and I think persuasively, that it's not simply a question of this president has it in for the Canadians, or that he has a profound and deep and unique dislike for the Canadian Prime Minister. No, it's more a reflection of the president's worldview, if you will. And I want to talk to you about that. What I'm going to do over the next 20 minutes or so is to talk to you first a little bit about Trump's view and Trump's worldview, and how, in fact, that applies specifically to both how it applies to Canada. And I'm going to give you two specific examples, and that's how it's played out with regard to Trump's attacks and concerns with regard to the former North American Free Trade Agreement and his demands for a new NAFTA, if you will. And secondly, how it's played out with regard to Canada's participation in the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO. So, but first, let me offer a few comments that might be helpful with regard to Donald Trump's worldview, if you will. It's interesting, you know, every president since Bill Clinton has had considerable flexibility in defining and choosing which levers of national power they want to exercise to advance American foreign policy interests. In 1991, the Cold War ends, this ugly bipolar US-Soviet world ends, and the United States, at least momentarily, is left as the sole great power in the international system. And as such, every president, as I say, since Bill Clinton, has had this sort of great flexibility, great elbow room to maneuver in a way that allows the president to define and advance American foreign policy interests in a way that hasn't been the case between 1945 and 1991. So it's really no surprise that we should at some point in time have a president, in this case Donald Trump, who is openly determined to question and refute the core guiding principles of American foreign policy, to challenge the multilateral institutions that define the international system, and frankly be skeptical of the international treaties that have been such an important part of Washington's internal engagement since 1945. And he would do this at the time he was elected to office in 2016. That was very clear. When he was elected right off the bat, it became, as you can see from this image, on election night, it suggested that there were things to come, and quite honestly, there have been. So when you look at Trump's engagement with the international community, that engagement was recently described by the New York Times as a doctrine of disentanglement, retrenchment, and realignment. What he's fundamentally seeking to do is to redefine and reimagine what America's national interests are and how the nation engages the world. At its very core, Trump's direction or doctrine rather, is driven by a political calculus grounded in a belief that America's participation in the world is simply too expansive and frankly too expensive. And perhaps more to the point, the burden of leadership is not fairly shared. It's disproportionately on the back of the United States taxpayer, he suggests. American commitments, most especially existing multilateral trade and security arrangements for everything from the United Nations to the World Trade Organization, the G7, NATO, etc., are, as currently constituted, viewed as serving the needs of others, not the United States. Well, the costs associated with these operations, as Trump would suggest, are being unfairly, disproportionately underwritten by the US, and this has to frankly stop. Trump's foreign policy, therefore, should above all else be regarded as an invitation to correct these imbalances. You know, regardless of the issue, the actor, the institution, Trump is pursuing an unrelenting campaign of orchestrating significant change in American foreign relations. And we see that clearly in the presidential campaign that is underway now on a whole variety of fronts, perhaps most notably with regard to America's relationship with China. So the record's clear over the past 4 years. There have been international agreements that are viewed as counterproductive to American national interests, such as the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the Paris Climate Agreement, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action on Iran's nuclear activities, the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty. They've all been dismissed, criticized, and then abandoned. And the list of nations towards which Trump has moved to reconfigure Washington's relationship is very noteworthy. Russia, China, North Korea, Iran, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Cuba, Israel, and the list goes on. And that includes Canada. So what do we need to know? What's so special? What about Canada? What does the record show about Canada? If Trump is trying to redefine American foreign engagement in the world, and he's finding it to be too expensive and too expansive, how does this apply to the Canadians and the US-Canada relationship? Well, I think it's fair to say that the United States, under the leadership of President Trump, has sought to define America's relationship with Canada in a way that seeks to pursue an America First strategy, even with its closest ally and nearest neighbor. This strategy, in the post-Cold War world, changes in many respects sort of the norms of the relationship that have prevailed from 1945 right through to the time that Mr. Trump became president. Early in his administration, there were pointed demands from the White House to revisit and quote unquote fix unsatisfactory bilateral and multilateral trade and security arrangements, punctuated, of course, by unpredictable on and off again negotiations. The principal targets I mentioned a few moments ago of those disagreements and issues that got under the skin of President Trump when it came to Canada were the North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA, and the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, the operations of it, NATO. So what I'm going to do now is spend a few moments talking about each of these, about the US position vis-a-vis Canada on NAFTA. I'm going to give you some of the details of the negotiations and the new agreement that replaced NAFTA, the USMCA. And then I'll turn to say a few words, briefer words about NATO. But needless to say, as far as Mr. Trump's worldview is concerned, that's what's principally informing his approach towards Canada. As I say, it's not that the Canadians are particularly irksome or bothersome or pest, but rather that this is just part of a broader worldview that the president brings to many countries and many issues. So NAFTA. You'll probably remember when President Trump was running for office against many other Republican nominees at the time before he secured the nomination and then was running directly against the Democratic nominee, Hillary Clinton. He pledged he would restore greatness for America. He said he would undo fair trade practices. He would stop cheap foreign labor from competing against the United States manufacturing base. And he would look and he would point to what we'll call foreign-friendly trade agreements. These were the key culprits in America's economic decline from his perspective. He specifically targeted NAFTA. NAFTA was, if you recall his campaign rallies, in fact, he's still using NAFTA as sort of a benchmark for what constitutes a horrible, unjust, unbalanced international trade agreement. But during that presidential primary in 2016, it was very clear that he would continue to hammer the message that NAFTA was, quote unquote, the most flawed international agreement ever crafted between nations. During his first presidential debate with Hillary Clinton on September the 26th, 2016, he said that NAFTA was, quote, the single worst trade deal ever approved in this country. He claimed that the terms and conditions of the agreement, which came into being in 1994, including Canada, the US, and Mexico, had systematically worked to disadvantage and harm the United States. And so there was a real clear need to revisit that agreement. He claimed that tens of thousands of working class plant employees in the United States had been terminated as companies relocated factory production to Mexico. Canada, for its part, had benefited by having preferential access to the largest single national market in the world. And it had developed a very healthy annual goods and services surplus from its engagement with the US. And what was even more irksome to the president when it came to Canada was he argued that Canada embraced a protectionist approach in certain sectors, most notably dairy products, which we'll return to in a moment, that effectively made the import of American products to Canada too expensive or simply not possible. So if you go back and you were to do a paper for a class like an introduction to Canada or an honors thesis, and you simply had to look at the course of his press conferences, speeches, Twitter statements in 2016 and through 17, you would see that to him, NAFTA was the absolute worst thing on earth, and it had to be immediately renegotiated or jettisoned in its entirety. So what happened? Well, Canadians heard this and they were concerned because they need access to the United States market. Depending on any given day, you know, at some point in time, almost 87% of Canadian exports were going to the United States. And now it's down between the 70 and 80% range, closer to 70. But the fact is, the United States matters far more for Canada as an export destination than Canada does for the United States. So Canada had to pay attention to these rumblings and these concerns raised by the new American president. So in 2017, negotiations that were aimed at revising NAFTA began. They were periodically punctuated by very acrimonious remarks between Trump and Trudeau, right through to September of 2018. And by August of 18, some significant progress had been made between the United States and Mexico. But Canada at that point in August of 18 had not signed on, was not part of any agreement. And the Trump administration basically said, look, we've got an agreement with the Mexicans. Canada, will you jump on board, or we're going to, you know, sign up a bilateral agreement directly with Mexico, with Enrique Nieto, who was the president at the time. So would Canada choose to respond was the question. And the White House, in their public declarations, wasted no time in declaring their willingness to move on if Canada said, we don't want to play ball. Robert Lighthizer, the US Trade Representative, said, quote, ideally, we'll have the Canadians involved. If we don't have Canada involved, we'll notify Congress that we have a bilateral deal that Canada at a later date is free to join. President Trump was decidedly less equivocal in his remarks, taking to Twitter on September the 1st, 2018 to declare that, quote, there is no political necessity to keep Canada in the new NAFTA deal. If we don't make a fair deal for the US after decades of abuse, Canada will be out. This slide shows you, gives you a little sample of what one cartoonist viewed as President Trump's oversized position when it came to what the message he was trying to send in August of 2018 to Canada, Canadian negotiators, and on the far right, Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. So what we saw in September of 2018 was a lot of back and forth, seemingly nonstop negotiations, but it also seemed that little progress was being made. There was a deadline set of September 30th to try and do this, and then you know, it wasn't looking good. In fact, on the 26th of September, the president, who had refused to meet Canada's Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, at the UN General Assembly session in New York, said that Canada was, quote, still treating the US very badly. At that time, Trump also unveiled a direct threat. He said, quote, if Canada was unprepared to expeditiously move forward and conclude a new trilateral trade agreement, the United States would move to impose a significant new 25% tax on any car exported into the US from Canada. A move that, if it were carried out, would put an estimated 250,000 people out of work, which was significant, specifically in the province of Ontario, and would be very injurious to the Canadian economy. As Trump said, frankly, we're talking about just taxing cars coming in from Canada. That's the mother lode. That's the big one. We're very unhappy with the negotiations and the negotiating style of Canada. Reaffirming his intense dislike of NAFTA and how the United States felt they were being taken advantage of, he said, I don't like NAFTA. I've never liked it. It's been very bad for the United States. It's been great for Canada, great for Mexico. We were very well along with Mexico. The relation's very good. We'll see what happens with Canada. They happen to be charging us 300% tariffs on dairy. We can't allow that to happen. The Canadians were more circumspect in the response, said that they're going to try and continue to work on a deal, even with the September 30th deadline that met Canadian national interests. What ended up happening, and I won't go into the intense details here, but basically there was an intensive video link negotiation between Washington and Ottawa over about 4 days. And by September 30th, lo and behold, the United States-Mexico-Canada agreement was produced. Amongst the other provisions in this agreement, the accord satisfied American concerns over Canadian protectionist policies with regard to its dairy market. It essentially opened access to the Canadian dairy market to allow the United States to sell a greater range and volume of products to Canada. It was a significant increase in pharmaceutical patents by Canada to 10 years, and it revamped the rules governing the manufacturing of automobiles in an effort to grow automotive jobs in the United States. And for Canada, more than anything else, putting aside the terms and conditions of the agreement, let's be clear. Why Canada moved to sign this and ultimately agreed to this USMCA was because they were working to avert what one person calls the threat of a disastrous North American trade war. They wanted to continue to ensure preferential access to the US marketplace for an extended period of time. And after the agreement was announced, there were some lovely words shared by everybody, including the Prime Minister and what was I going to say, President Trump, who said that the USMCA is a great deal for all three countries. When he spoke at the White House Rose Garden, he said, we have very strong tensions. It was just an unfair deal, referencing the old NAFTA agreement, whether it was Mexico or Canada. And now it's a fair deal for everybody. It's a much different deal. It's a brand new deal. It's not NAFTA redone. Throughout the campaign, I promised to renegotiate NAFTA, and today we have kept that promise. The USMCA was signed by President Trump, Prime Minister Trudeau, and President Nieto at an international summit meeting in Buenos Aires on November the 30th, 2018. If that gives you a little flavor, at least, for American policy vis-a-vis Canada on the question of trade, let's turn just for a moment to the question of security. And in some respects, you won't be surprised to hear that Canada's engagement in and contributions to NATO, from President Trump's perspective, have been and remain insufficient. In fact, even today, they remain insufficient. So he's taken and he sought to consistently push the position that Canada must do more. Ottawa needs, from Washington's perspective, to commit additional financial and material assets to the alliance. That's critical. So, and you'll see here a little sneak peek of Mr. Trudeau and Mr. Trump to display the warmth that exists between the two of them when it comes to discussing security related or even trade related matters. So what did Canada need to do? Well, when Trump looked at how NATO was financed and how NATO operated, he then and now believes that a disproportionate share of the responsibility and costs of operating NATO fall directly on the US. Other nations make less equitable contributions, such as Canada, and that's a tremendous source of agitation to Mr. Trump. As Mr. Trump would say, we're the schmucks that are paying for the whole thing. He announced that and during a campaign rally, he said, many countries owe us a tremendous amount of money for many back years, while they're delinquent as far as I'm concerned because the United States has had to pay for them. The president wants a strong NATO. National Security or former National Security Affairs advisor to President Trump, John Bolton, said, when people talk about undermining the NATO alliance, you should look at those carrying out steps that make NATO less effective militarily. So the most acute criticisms that were leveled by the president against Canada in terms of its commitment to NATO came in June and July of 2018. There was a July 2018 NATO summit that was being held in Brussels, and just on the immediate, just before the summit was to start, Mr. Trump on the 19th of June sent off letters to the political leadership of several member nations of NATO, including Canada's Prime Minister Trudeau. Pardon me. And he was exhorting Trudeau and other fellow alliance members to do more for NATO. He noted that there was, quote unquote, a growing frustration in the United States with the alliance's current underwriting commitments. Trump said that the United States, with regard to Canada, expected, quote, to see a strong recommitment by Canada to meet the goals to which we have all agreed in the Defense Investment Pledge. That was a pledge, just by a footnote here. It was agreed to at a summit in Wales in 2014, where all NATO signatories agreed that they would spend 2% of the gross domestic product on national defense by 2024. And Canada's level of military spending, of course, was well known to NATO, well known to President Trump going into the summit. Ottawa was clearly in the bottom third of NATO member spending. For example, in 2018, it was spending 1.23% of its gross domestic product, way short of the 2% goal, right? The only countries under Canada were states like Belgium and Hungary, Luxembourg, Slovenia, and Spain. Trump's letter to Trudeau was blunt in pointing out, that it recognized that Canada had made military contributions, particularly as part of NATO in Afghanistan. But he said, this did not excuse Canada from your commitments to ensure NATO has the resources it needs. Canada's continued defense spending of less than 2% undermines the security of the alliance. Well, how did Prime Minister Trudeau react to this sort of slap on the hands on the immediate, on the cusp, if you will, of this summit in July of 2018 in Brussels? Well, as you might imagine, there's starting to be a pattern here. When President Trump is irritated, and not specifically about Canada, but Canada fits into that particular framework, well, Canada, takes hell, is given hell by the president. And so I think Canada, was suspecting that this was coming. Their reaction immediately was to underscore their unwavering commitment to NATO, saying that it had been a long-standing role as an active contributor in global peace and security. It had contributed to every NATO since the foundation of the alliance in 1949. And this, by the way, Trump's sort of get your act together and pour more money and manpower into NATO came just after that unproductive G7 meeting I cited at the start of our conversation today, a meeting in which, as I said earlier, Trump called Trudeau dishonest and weak. So Canada basically said, okay, what are we going to do here? We're going to be at this summit. We've got the President of the United States saying, can you step up and do more? So what Ottawa did was they took a couple of preemptive moves, and I think it was frankly smart. And that was on the eve of the Brussels summit, Canada decided to renew and expand its manpower commitment for Canada's, the largest number of forces are Canadian, leading NATO's multinational enhanced forward presence battle group in Latvia. At the summit itself, Ottawa committed to, quote, assuming command of NATO's new multinational non-combat training capacity building mission in Iraq in the first year of operations. And of course, Canada reaffirmed its commitment to all aspects of the defense investment pledge. For Trump, not necessarily getting everything he wanted, but getting something from the Canadians. The conclusion of the multilateral meetings in Brussels was, from his perspective, at least somewhat marginally successful. He got Canada and other NATO members to move forward and agree to reaffirm this 2% spending threshold, and to also agree to increase that target to 4%. So, pardon me, he was quite happy. He got something that he could walk away with, and for political reasons, suggests that American foreign policy interests have been advanced. So I'm going to conclude with a few remarks right now, and I think, and then I'll turn it over for Q&A if I can, that some of you may have. So what kind of conclusions can we draw from our review of American foreign policy toward Canada under President Trump? It's a good question. There's an illustration of President Trump's, it may be a bit graphic and a bit over the top, but the fact is that Mr. Trump looks at the international community as one that he and he alone has the ability to shape and move. So how is we're in a presidential election campaign. How do we see the remainder of his tenure going to be with regard to America's policy towards its northern neighbor? I think it would be silly not to think that the United States under Trump will continue to be distinguished by efforts to advance America's national interests, to try and recraft existing and future arrangements that favor U.S. businesses, U.S. workers. I think that's pretty clear. I don't think that there's any question about that. The key question, in a recent article, a long distinguished ambassador of Canada to the United States and principal advisor to some of Canada's most prominent prime ministers the last 30 or 40 years, suggested this. Derek Burney, writing in the American Review of Canadian Studies, said the key question about the future of Canada-U.S. relations is whether the erratic America First impulses of Donald Trump will persist after he leaves the White House. If the tide of nationalist populism takes root, raw self-interest will prevail, and the days of a special or privileged partnership for Canada with the United States will fade into history. Canada has benefited more than most nations from the advantage of its geography, but proximity to the global superpower has also bred a cocoon of complacency on trade and security that is no longer assured. Canada cannot alter its geography. And management of relations with the US will inevitably be its predominant priority. But the notion of privilege or special status that served Canadians well in recent decades and was often stimulated by the personalities of the moment can no longer be taken for granted. Thank you. So that's an effort to begin a conversation to let folks think a little bit about, particularly for our SUNY Plattsburgh students, a little bit about the nature of why the US relationship with Canada is being conducted in sort of an acrimonious way right now, and what's driving President Trump's foreign policy towards its most northerly and immediate neighbor. So, and with that, I'm going to turn it over to Amy.
Thank you, Chris, for sharing your perspectives on how President Trump has approached foreign policy toward Canada and the world. It's now time for questions and answers. So let's continue our conversation. We did have at least one question submitted in advance, so I'll turn to that in a moment. But in the meantime, I just want to remind folks who've joined us today that you should find a Q&A button on your screen, and that's where we'd love for you to submit any questions you have for Chris. So thank you. I'll be happy to moderate the questions. We'll start with, how do you assess the US-Canada relationship? Is it in trouble for the long term?
I hope not. Which is to say, no. I think that, you know, a phrase that was used many years ago in various formats and royal commissions and books, in speeches by ambassadors, these ties that bind the United States and Canada are so omnipresent and deep that it seems hard to believe that the sort of disgruntledness of one particular president is going to somehow, you know, scuttle what is an otherwise vibrant, healthy relationship. Despite agreements on policy issues from time to time, I don't think that's the case. I think we've got a well-established, particularly since 1945 or 45, vibrant, interlocked, integrated economic and North American security relationship that has only continued to evolve in deeper and deeper ways. So I don't think that we have any cause for concern. I think when you hear bellicose statements coming out of the White House or from President Trump's advisors, you've just got to take them with a grain of salt.
Okay, next question. Should Donald Trump be reelected in November, what do you see as the most pressing issues for the US-Canada relationship?
That's a great question. I think the most pressing issues, you know, there's questions out there with regard to the state of the US Chinese relationship and to what extent Canada can help or not help in terms of the direction that President Trump is looking to go by. In many respects, I think it's fair to say decoupling that relationship and trying to move China away from the center of the economic global world. I think it's going to be fair to say that we're going to continue to hear from time to time. You're going to hear offers of the president to impose tariffs on, you know, imports of Canadian aluminum, for example, or you're going to hear concerns about, oh, you know, we've reviewed what the Canadians are doing on the dairy front in the new USMCA and they're not living up to their obligations. So we need to impose some kind of punitive economic penalty on Canada. And I think certainly with regard to on security issues, I think the North American continent in terms of its shared continental fence responsibilities is intact, and it's going to stay that way. I don't see President Trump walking away from that. He has at times, and there are some suggestions that should he win a second term, that he's prepared to walk away from NATO. He sees as an anachronistic alliance that was meant to deal with the former Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact and the possibility of conventional war on the European continent. And that's not going to happen, right? That's what he says. So I think if he were to win that election, he may be prompted to sort of at least push Canada for more and more of a contribution. But even last night, Prime Minister Trudeau in Canada, in the speech from the throne read by Canada's Governor General, Julie Payette, and his subsequent press conference after, there was no mention of absolutely no mention of, oh, we're going to start sinking tons and tons of money into national defense, or put more money into NATO or into North American defense. That's not a priority for Canada, and hasn't been for a long time.
We have a few questions along the same line. So one is, how might an election of Joe Biden alter U.S. foreign policy toward Canada? Will it signal a return to the close ties of the Obama-Trudeau years? And another version is, do you think the relationship will improve if Trump is not reelected in November?
If Trump is not reelected on November the 3rd, and of course, we'll see if that happens, or on the 3rd or any day thereafter, both politically and in terms of the potential judicial outcome. The fact of the matter is, if Joe Biden is elected as president, his worldview, Joe Biden's perspective on what matters in international affairs and how you approach international affairs is, yes, he's a student of the post-war international security and trade arrangements that were put in place. He's supportive of NATO. He's supportive of the World Trade Organization. He's supportive of the Paris Climate Accord. He's supportive of so many things that President Trump isn't. So, and where does Canada fit in that? Joe Biden's had a long-standing positive relationship with many Canadian government and officials. I would strongly suspect that what you're going to see is an embrace, a warm embrace between Washington and Ottawa, in a way that we're going to see a rekindling of the relationship, and you're not going to, the Canadians, the Prime Minister can go to bed at night and not worry about Joe Biden sending off a tweet saying, oh, these Canadians are the worst thing since sliced bread. I think it'll be a return to a much more normal position.
Okay, thank you. Another question here is, what U.S.-Canada trade frictions or U.S.-Canada-NATO related frictions do you think are most likely to persist even if Trump is a one-term president and America First impulses recede somewhat?
That's a very good question. I think on the security side with regard to NATO, I think that, the issue for Canada, regardless of whether President Trump has decided to call it out or not, has always been its level of commitment to NATO. Everybody's understood long before President Trump came along that Canada really doesn't invest a lot in NATO. And I'm sorry, I mean, you can quantitatively, qualitatively, you can look at that in so many ways. The truth is there have been episodes, but over the course of time, Canada's not exactly at the forefront of NATO. So I think even with the Joe Biden presidency, you're going to have occasions when, at least at a Department of Defense to Canadian Department of National Defense level, there's going to be suggestions about, what more can you do? And how can you do it and where can you do it? But unfortunately, for Canada, public opinion polls show that questions of national defense rank number 73. And that's obviously a bit of an exaggeration, but the point is national defense doesn't register in the everyday mind of Canadians. They're more concerned about everything from healthcare, especially during the COVID-19 pandemic, access, pharmaceuticals, quality of care in long-term facilities, daycare, those sorts of things. And that's that's as I often said, that's a function of not being a great power. You have the luxury not to worry about national defense that much. I think that would be at least on the security side. And on the trade side, I think as a potential source of disagreement is that to the extent that Canada doesn't live up to, letting its guard down, if you will, as called for under the terms and conditions of the USMCA, especially with regard to dairy products. So.
Okay, thank you. Next question. What is your view on softwood lumber trade dispute in the short and long run?
Say that again.
What is your view on the softwood lumber trade dispute in the short and long run?
In the short and long run, it's going to, I think, continue to be like The Young and the Restless. It's soap opera-like. It just continues on, and there's tweaks, and there's challenges, and there's, tribunal rulings. This is not going to be solved anytime soon. It's going to continue to be a source of irritation. There's well-organized lobby groups on both sides of the border that make it fundamentally difficult, if you will, to solve this. So I think it's going to be, I don't want to say it's an intractable issue, but it's going to continue to remain a bilateral irritant at the highest degree.
Okay, next question. I was wondering why Canada, especially Justin Trudeau, has shown as much restraint as he has.
Yeah,
Is that a result of the uneven balance of power between the two nations? Also, will his patience wear thin should Trump win re-election?
It's a function of him in part being Canadian and polite, as we all sort of know, but it's also a function, in fact, as you point out, of this unequal power balance. He can't, as much as Mr. Trump likes to raise hell and use names and suggest Canada's not a full and willing participant in a variety of things or taking advantage of Washington. The truth is, it would be too easy and too tempting, frankly, for Canada just to resort to those sorts of tactics. So Canada has to be careful. It's got some significant economic issues at stake in terms of its health. It needs access to the United States. Not only is it a consumer of economic security, but it's a consumer of physical military security. So truthfully, Canada is restrained in its ability to do this, at least publicly. I think sometimes what goes on behind closed doors between officials, between the Department of State, Global Affairs Canada, and other agency to agency discussions is considerably, the record shows, much blunter, and the Canadians speak much more freely. So I think, that Canada's going to continue to, every indication suggests that Canada's going to continue to stand on guard, so to speak, for its chief priorities. They just recognize that sort of that back and forth tit for tat type of name calling that you would find in a child's schoolyard, frankly, isn't productive.
Thank you. Next question. Are there specific impacts on our region of the North Country in New York State that you could quantify? For example, pre-COVID border restrictions, as we know that's having an impact, or specific impacts on higher education that you can quantify?
Well, sure. On the latter question, I mean, let's take SUNY Plattsburgh, for example. We don't have a tremendous number of Canadian students who come to study here. But the truth is, generally speaking, students from the North Country who want to go study up in Canada, it's in simple terms, it can be done, and because it's allowed. But if you're going north of the border, whether you're going to British Columbia or going to Quebec, it's a 14-day mandatory quarantine. And whoever brings you up there has to quarantine for 14 days. So, there's those physical impediments, if you will. For the North Country, there have been a lot of voices raised over the last few months, and rightly so, by business officials, lobbyists, political officials alike, who've suggested that you know, we're really, it's the current closure of the border is having a significant impact on local businesses. And I have no doubt that that is indeed the case. And it's also pointed out that it's an impediment to family relations and for folks who need to cross the border from time to time, or for people who own property, particularly folks from Quebec and the greater Montreal area who own property in the North Country. Yes, it's an inconvenience, that's what's pointed out, but it's obviously more than that. At the same time, we have to bear in mind, I think, when there's some impatience and discouragement with the fact that there haven't been sort of a phased in plan put out as to what will happen, and I suspect that will be forthcoming at some point sooner rather than later. You know, authorities are looking at the numbers, and they're looking, for example, in the last 2 days in Ontario and Quebec alone, you know, substantial numbers of people tested positive with COVID. They're looking at not necessarily New York State per se, but they're looking at the United States as a whole. And they're saying, well, there's certain regions, but there's clearly no national plan in effect. How frequently really are people social distancing? In fact, I can tell you quite honestly, this past Saturday, I was driving back from Lake George, New York, and I was driving through the village on a Saturday evening, and I would say, and it was quite busy, and I would say a good 60 or 70% of people who were walking on the street, and there were a lot of people on the street, on the sidewalks, were not wearing a mask. We're not social distancing. So, you know, there's a lot of concern, however you look at this. You know, so there are concerns, obviously, for our North Country, but I think we need to be patient. That border is not going to be open to my understanding, even in phased increments for a while, for quite a stretch. The numbers suggest to public health authorities that it makes sense to continue to keep it closed.
Thank you. How much work do you think that a successor to Trump will have to do to restore trust in the Canada-US relations?
That's a great question. I don't think it's that significant because the option was Joe Biden. If it was somebody who was a neophyte, who didn't know the levers of government, who didn't have pre-existing relationships with Canadian officials, departments, etc., I think it might be a tougher sled, but I don't think it will be. I mean, I think Joe Biden values Canada. He values the US-Canada relationship. And I think he'll move quickly to restore, you know, a lot of what he's going to have to engage in right from the outset. And I don't know how long this will take, but certainly in the area of foreign relations is to, some would say, do a reset. I don't know if it's a reset per se, but the truth is there's a lot that needs to be, from his perspective, changed because his predecessor, President Trump, has gone about it in a way and set about a new direction for American foreign policy that is antithetical to American interests. So it'll take time.
On that note, how do you see a Biden administration changing the damage wrought by President Trump, and how quickly? Do you actually see it as damage, or in fairness, has President Trump raised some valid issues?
No, I think it's fair to say that it would take time because people, once again, they're not looking to do a reset or turn the clock back to the way things were. They're looking to make sure that the channels that have long existed between Canada and the United States, from government to government, provincial, municipal, and federal, political and bureaucratic, that all those channels are open, they're lubricated, they're working well, that there's, you know, no longer sort of a sense of hostility from Washington towards Ottawa. That can be done, I think, relatively quickly. In part, it's going to require turning over people at the Department of State, especially, but also at the Department of Defense and within the White House staff. That's going to take some time, but it will be done, and will be done, as I would guess, as quickly as possible. And Amy, what was the second part of that question, please? If you don't mind.
Okay, do you actually see it as damage, or in fairness, has President Trump raised some valid issues?
That's an excellent second part to that question. I think we should have expected, as I said at the outset of my remarks today, any president post 1945, post Cold War, post 1991, sooner or later, some president, didn't have to be Donald Trump, was going to come along and say, look, everything that we constructed post 45, do we really need it? Is it working for America? Is it working to our advantage, disadvantage? And to the extent that that exercise has gone through, I don't think it's a terrible thing. I think, in fact, it's a healthy thing. What I don't find to be healthy and what I don't find to be useful is when you have a president using language and his advisors using language and taking steps and doing things in the way they do. There's a way to do business, and it's not one that I would encourage the United States government to follow.
I wonder, I have a question here about the U.S. dairy access to the Canadian market. And I wonder if you would like to comment about the regulations and labeling that maybe, not on just dairy, but are there restrictions on health and safety laws?
That's a good question. I won't per se comment on that because I'm not a specialist in that area. All I can say to any of my Canadian friends who are watching this today, as someone who lives 30 or 25 years in Canada and has lived 35 years or so in the United States, is that once you get a taste, it's sort of like wine. Everybody thought Canadian wine was wonderful. And then you get a taste of, okay, there's great regions of the world, but once you've start to get a taste of American Napa Valley and other stuff, you go, whoa, this is wine. This is really good. You're going to have the same experience when you have Sargento cheese. There's all these craft cheesemakers are wonderful, but America does a wonderful job with wholesale national cheese products. So be prepared to say, wow, is that what cheese tastes like? Anyway, so. Yeah.
Well, folks, I guess our last question will be a personal thought on, do you think there will be any technical problems with the mail-in vote?
There has to be, because the president said there will be, right? Whether it's isolated, simple cases, or whether it's more widespread, I can guarantee you that in the immediate lead up to November 3rd and thereafter, especially depending on the nature of the total vote that is counted and released on the 3rd and 4th of November, that you can expect a full-fledged challenge, I would suggest principally by the president, to suggest that somehow, if it's a given state and the vote is close, that, these votes shouldn't count, or we have to wait to count these votes. So yeah, I mean, I think we, looking forward to early November, I don't think we've seen anything yet in terms of this presidential campaign. And I think Canadians are daily mystified, confused, and interested in what's going on in the United States in terms of this national election. Not simply because Donald Trump is the president, but because so much is at stake for them as well. So, thank you, Amy.
Well, folks, we are out of time for questions. At this time, we ask for your feedback on the screen via the Zoom poll being presented to you. I'd like to say thank you, Chris, so much for kicking off our inaugural conversation on Canada, and special thanks to our virtual audience participants and to our supporters at SUNY Plattsburgh, the U.S. Department of Education, and the Québec Ministry of International Relations and La Francophonie.
And we'll see you again. Am I correct to say our second conversation is October the 13th with Andre Picard, national columnist for the Globe and Mail, talking about as Amy is posting here, the pandemic experience in Canada and looking at the US by comparison. So we strongly encourage you to, if you've not heard Andre speak, he's wonderful, and we look forward to having you join us for that conversation.
Yes, and I'll go ahead and I'll put those registration links in the chat. So
Thank you. Thank you.
thanks again, everyone, and wishing you a wonderful rest of your day.
Thanks, guys. Appreciate you taking the time to listen.